Good to see you again. Let's get started.
The lone gunman theory revisited. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the reading room of the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. It was April 2025, and public interest was swelling once again around one of America's most controversial and tragic events, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. A new batch of previously classified documents, recently declassified under the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act, had hit the shelves. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists poring over the scanned microfiches and worn documents. Among the readers sat Dr. Elaine Monroe, a quiet, fiercely intelligent political historian from Georgetown University. She adjusted her thin glasses, scrolling slowly through a digitized file labeled CIA Field Report, Mexico City, October 1963. Her expression tightened. Lee Harvey Oswald, she murmured, highlighting the name for the third time in 15 minutes. The document outlined a conversation intercepted at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. A man who identified himself as Oswald had allegedly attempted to secure a visa to travel to Cuba, then on to the Soviet Union. The voice analysis in the accompanying report, however, noted subtle inconsistencies. Was it Oswald, or someone posing as him? The official record, the Warren Commission report of 1964, had concluded that Oswald acted alone when he fired 3 shots from the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas on November 22, 1963. That single conclusion, repeated in history textbooks for generations, now trembled under the weight of new evidence. Elaine's fingers danced across her tablet. She had already reviewed several documents in the past few days that raised eyebrows. Internal CIA memos suggesting foreknowledge of Oswald's movements, FBI surveillance reports buried in footnotes, and now this. An anomaly in Mexico City. For Elaine, the question was no longer just whether Oswald acted alone, but how the machinery of Cold War paranoia might have distorted the truth. Back in Washington, D.C., journalist Theo Calder was struggling with a different challenge. His editor at The Observer, a mid-sized independent outlet, had greenlit a long-form investigative piece titled The Lone Gunman Theory Revisited. Theo, a veteran of political exposes and a known skeptic of official narratives, was in his element. He had spent weeks combing through the newly released 2025 batch of JFK documents. What stood out most was a 1964 memo between J. Edgar Hoover and CIA Director John McCone. The memo, marked top secret, mentioned an urgent need to contain public speculation about Oswald's potential ties to foreign operatives. Contained within the same file was an intercepted cable from the KGB, dated December 1963, which referred to Oswald as a disoriented Marxist pawn who was not considered reliable for future work. That seemed to corroborate the narrative of Oswald as a lone, unhinged actor. Yet the same document hinted that the Soviets were monitoring Oswald's activities as early as 1962, well before the assassination. Was Oswald manipulated? If so, by whom? Theo's notes sprawled across his apartment wall, threads of string-connected names and events. Oswald, Marina, his wife, David Atlee Phillips, a CIA officer stationed in Mexico City, George de Mohrenschildt, a mysterious oilman linked to Oswald, and the House Select Committee on Assassination's 1979 report which, in contrast to the Warren Commission, concluded JFK was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. His gut told him that these new documents didn't necessarily blow open a massive conspiracy, but they also didn't support the official conclusion with any new confidence. Elaine Monroe's interest in Oswald's Mexico City trip had deepened. She reviewed surveillance photos taken by CIA operatives. According to multiple eyewitness accounts, Oswald visited the Cuban and Soviet embassies between September 27 and October 2, 1963. But none of the images matched Oswald's known appearance precisely. One man in the photos, dubbed the Mexico City Mystery Man, had a different hairline, a broader nose. The discrepancy wasn't new. The CIA had long claimed the photographs were inconclusive, but a newly released transcript of an internal CIA meeting from 1967 revealed that some within the agency believed the man was an imposter, perhaps deliberately inserted to confuse intelligence agencies or to mimic Oswald's behavior. Elaine scribbled in her notebook. Was Oswald being impersonated to create a trail of false associations? The implications were enormous. If someone wanted to connect Oswald to Cuba or the USSR, it could have provided the perfect Cold War motive. But who would want that? Rogue anti-Castro groups? A faction within the intelligence community? Foreign agents? More critically, why did these anomalies not shake the foundations of the Warren Commission's findings? Meanwhile, Theo dug into another cornerstone of the lone gunman theory, the so-called magic bullet that allegedly struck both President Kennedy and Texas Governor John Connally. The Warren Commission's conclusion rested heavily on the trajectory of that single bullet, which supposedly passed through Kennedy's neck and into Connally's chest, wrist, and thigh. But among the new documents was a ballistics review conducted in 1975 by Army forensic experts. Unreleased until now, it included newly digitized 3D scans of bullet fragments found in the presidential limousine. The analysis suggested the pristine condition of the magic bullet was, at the very least, inconsistent with the damage profile documented in Connally's X-rays. More troubling was a suppressed memo from Secret Service agents who believed a second shot struck Kennedy's head from the front, a finding that echoed the controversial Zapruder film, which showed JFK's head snapping backward. Theo knew this wouldn't be enough to prove multiple shooters, but it raised valid questions. Why were these forensic inconsistencies buried for so long? Why weren't they part of the mainstream narrative? In late April, Elaine traveled to Miami, Florida. The city was once a hub of anti-Castro exiles and CIA operatives. One of the newer documents revealed that Oswald had been seen at a gun range in the Everglades just weeks before the assassination, accompanied by individuals later identified as members of Alpha 66, a paramilitary anti-Castro group. Though the FBI had investigated the sighting, their conclusion was that the witnesses were likely mistaken. Yet one of those witnesses, a Cuban exile named Luis Alvarez, had filed an affidavit stating Oswald practiced with an Italian Carcano rifle, the same model used in the assassination. Elaine tracked down Alvarez's grandson, who revealed that his grandfather had spoken frequently about the encounter, insisting until his death that the man he saw was definitely Oswald. The grandson provided an audio recording of an interview Luis had done with a local Miami radio host in 1983, never aired, where he alleged the FBI threatened to discredit him if he kept talking. Elaine sat in silence as the raspy voice of the old exile spoke over the tape. They said it was just a lone gunman, but I saw him with others. They were training for something big. The tape continued, crackling slightly, the voice of Luis Alvarez growing more intense as he described Oswald laughing and talking in broken Spanish with two other men, one dark-skinned, wearing a military-style cap, the other tall and pale, with a pronounced Boston accent. Elaine listened closely, rewinding portions to catch every word. She jotted down a note. Verify identities. Cross-check CIA rosters plus exile group contacts from 1963. Back in Washington, Theo Calder was following a different lead. He'd gained access to internal documents from the Warren Commission's legal staff, notes and letters previously stored in a private archive of one of the late assistant counsels. Among them, Theo found a letter from staff attorney Wesley Liebeler expressing serious doubts about key witness testimony. Too many inconsistencies, Liebeler had written in a handwritten margin. We are ignoring evidence that doesn't fit. That comment haunted Theo. If even commission members had privately questioned the clean-cut narrative, why hadn't they pushed back harder? Was the goal truth or closure? He reached out to Marina Oswald Porter, now in her 80s and long removed from public life. Surprisingly, she agreed to a brief phone interview. Her voice was quiet, reflective, carrying the weight of decades. They wanted to believe he was just a crazy man, she said. But Lee was angry, not crazy. He was used, in ways I didn't understand then. He felt watched. He said things like, "They'll blame me." She paused. "They did." Theo pressed gently. "Do you believe he acted alone?" There was a long silence. "No," she said finally. "But I don't know who helped. Maybe not even he did." The emotional core of the story was beginning to form. These weren't just shadowy documents anymore. They were real people, caught in something far bigger than they could grasp at the time. Oswald's behavior, erratic yet patterned, paranoid yet oddly methodical, made more sense if he was being guided, nudged, or even framed. Another document, declassified just months earlier, was a psychological profile prepared by the CIA in 1962, assessing Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union and his subsequent return to the U.S. The profile described him as manipulable, impressionable, emotionally insecure, craving significance. The phrase craving significance stuck with Theo. Oswald had been an oddball, no doubt, but that very quality made him an ideal fall guy. Meanwhile, Elaine followed up on the Mexico City mystery man. Through a contact at Interpol, she obtained a 1963 surveillance log from the Swiss embassy, which shared intelligence with both the CIA and KGB during the height of Cold War paranoia. The man captured in the Mexico City photos had been flagged by Swiss officials as possibly connected to European far-right activity, an unusual twist in the story. She matched his face against an AI-enhanced facial recognition database. The software returned a 92% match with a French mercenary named Henri Table, known to have done contract work in Algeria and, possibly, Cuba. Table's name never appeared in the Warren Commission report. Why had someone like him been near the Soviet embassy, impersonating Oswald? She reached out to Theo, and the two met over coffee in D.C., sharing what they had uncovered. Theo spread out his research on the coffee shop table, photographs and printouts layered like a mosaic of secrets. Elaine laid her findings beside his. "If we're right," Theo said slowly, "then Oswald wasn't just acting alone, or not alone. He might not have been acting at all. He might have been played." Elaine nodded. Or he was trying to play them and got swallowed up in something he didn't understand. Their theories were aligning. A manipulated Oswald. A fabricated trail to Cuba and the USSR. A cover-up, not necessarily of a vast conspiracy, but of institutional failure. Maybe even institutional involvement, accidental or not. They reviewed Oswald's route through New Orleans in the months before the assassination. He'd interacted with members of anti-Castro groups, had scuffles with Cuban exiles, and was even arrested for handing out pro-Castro flyers. But recently released FBI surveillance logs suggested the flyers were a red herring. A confidential informant reported that Oswald was working with Guy Bannister, a former FBI agent and outspoken anti-communist who ran a shadowy private intelligence office in New Orleans. Oswald's supposed communist sympathies? Possibly a role he was playing, on someone's payroll. A memo from 1963, stamped, "Do not circulate," detailed an internal debate within the CIA about whether Bannister had ties to ongoing agency operations. The file also contained a brief line, almost an afterthought. "Oh, potentially on list for limited domestic surveillance assignment. Category: expendable." The reference was never followed up, and the memo disappeared from the official record. That word, expendable, sent a chill down Theo's spine. Together, they decided to build a timeline that matched Oswald's movements with known agency operations, sightings, and communications. Patterns began to emerge. At each key point in his life after 1960, his defection to the USSR, his return to Texas, his brief time in New Orleans, and his Mexico City visit, there was either a potential intelligence contact or an unexplained sighting. Even the famous backyard photos of Oswald holding a rifle and Marxist literature began to look staged. A new forensic image analysis conducted in 2025, using AI to evaluate light angle consistency, revealed possible tampering. A whistleblower from the Defense Department quietly passed Elaine a supplemental report that had been sealed in 1978. The photo, the report concluded, showed minor spatial distortions suggestive of composite imagery. Theo summarized it best in his notes. Was Oswald a construct? A legend built to be erased? They weren't alone in their investigation anymore. A groundswell of journalists, digital archivists, and amateur sleuths were combing through the same files. Forums buzzed with newly released documents, obscure memos, and footnotes now illuminated in full context. Even members of Congress began requesting briefings from the National Archives. But while others chased grand conspiracies, the Mafia, the Soviets, the CIA, even extraterrestrials, Elaine and Theo's theory remained grounded. That the lone gunman theory was a simplification of a far murkier, bureaucratic truth. Oswald, they now believed, had likely been part of a low-level intelligence operation designed to appear radical, to bait foreign embassies or attract communist sympathizers. Somewhere along the way, that operation had either gone rogue or was hijacked by a group with its own agenda. And when Kennedy was shot, Oswald, predictable, isolated, and craving significance, became the perfect patsy. The morning of November 22, 1963, Dallas shimmered with anticipation. President Kennedy's motorcade route had been widely published. School children lined the sidewalks, waving American flags. Secret Service agents were posted along the way, alert but seemingly relaxed. No one suspected that a man with a $21.95 mail-order rifle would change history within seconds. But the newly released documents contained more than just intelligence reports. They included first-person testimonies that had never been reviewed by the Warren Commission. One such document was an audio transcription of a radio conversation between two Secret Service agents in Dealey Plaza just minutes before the shots rang out. In the transcript, one agent mentions a report of a man with a rifle seen on the grassy knoll, dismissed at the time as a prank call or mistaken identity. Even more intriguing was a memo written just 3 days later by FBI Special Agent James Hosty, who had been assigned to monitor Oswald in the weeks prior. Hosty admitted destroying a letter from Oswald delivered to the FBI office shortly before the assassination. The memo stated, "Subject threatened to go public if harassment continued," urged him to be silent for his own good. That letter's contents remained unknown, but its destruction, confirmed by Hosty decades later, raised critical questions. Why would Oswald threaten the FBI? What was he afraid they would reveal? Elaine and Theo debated the implications in their shared research document. Elaine, if Oswald was being used for an op and realized it had gone too far, that letter could have been a warning or a plea. Theo, or blackmail. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he wanted out. Elaine, then they had to silence him. In Dallas, Theo managed to locate a former clerk who worked at the Dallas Police Department in 1963. The man, now 84 and in failing health, agreed to speak under condition of anonymity. He recalled Oswald being unusually calm after his arrest, frustrated but not frightened. He kept saying, "I'm just a patsy. You don't know what you're doing. You're playing their game." Over and over, the man said. He didn't act like someone who'd just killed the president. He acted like someone who'd been betrayed. And then came Jack Ruby. The newly released files contained a set of long-overdue jail visitation logs showing that Ruby had met with known mob associate Joseph Campisi just 2 days before the assassination. The Warren Commission had minimized Ruby's mob ties. But these logs, along with a 1964 DEA surveillance report, placed Campisi in a series of phone calls with contacts in Havana and Miami days before Kennedy's trip. Theo followed this trail to Miami, where remnants of the anti-Castro exile community still lived in quiet neighborhoods. He met with the son of one of the Alpha 66 members who'd allegedly trained with Oswald. The man, middle-aged, cautious, and fluent in English and Spanish, shared a story passed down by his father. He said Oswald was there once. Not for long. They didn't like him. Thought he was too weird or fake. But my father said someone told him, "Keep him around. He's useful. Not for us, for them." He always wondered what that meant. Elaine, meanwhile, chased down a different lead, the so-called CIA withholding file, a trove of internal agency reviews and congressional testimonies sealed from public view for decades. It had finally been released in 2025 after a FOIA lawsuit. In it, she found a remarkable exchange between CIA legal counsel and the Church Committee staff in 1975. Church Committee staff: did the agency run any domestic assets connected to Lee Harvey Oswald? CIA legal counsel: that information is classified. Staff: but the commission was told there was no connection. Counsel: that remains the agency's position. Elaine read the exchange several times. The word position felt deliberately chosen. Not truth, not fact, just the narrative they upheld. She shared this with Theo, who responded immediately. That's the kind of legalese you use when your hands are dirty, but you want to claim you were wearing gloves. They began to draft their joint exposé, weaving together what they had found. The article's thesis was simple. Oswald may have fired the shots, or maybe not, but he certainly didn't act in isolation. Whether as a manipulated asset, an unwitting dupe, or a sacrificed liability, he was at the center of a storm built by Cold War paranoia, bureaucratic rivalry, and covert agendas. The real story, they argued, wasn't just about grassy knolls or second shooters. It was about the people who knew something was off and looked away. In their final section, they broke down the most compelling evidence that challenged the lone gunman theory, drawn from the newly declassified documents. Inconsistent surveillance. CIA and FBI documents prove that Oswald was under near constant observation, and yet no one intervened despite obvious red flags: his violent outbursts, his threats, his sudden travel plans. Impersonation in Mexico City. Evidence of an Oswald double or impersonator remained unrefuted by the CIA, even decades later, with surveillance photos and voice recordings not matching the known suspect. CIA obfuscation. Internal agency memos showed deliberate withholding of information from the Warren Commission and subsequent investigators, often justified by national security concerns. Mob ties to Ruby. New jail logs and surveillance reports provided stronger evidence that Ruby's motive to kill Oswald may have been more than a spontaneous act of revenge. Forensic anomalies. Ballistics and medical reports, previously buried, showed inconsistencies in trajectory, timing, and injuries that didn't neatly align with the official three-shot timeline. They ended the article with a haunting quote from a 1976 interview with Senator Richard Schweiker, a member of the Church Committee. The agencies expected the Warren Commission to be a cleanup operation, but the more we dig, the more it looks like a cover-up of multiple failures, or worse. As they prepared to publish, both Theo and Elaine received quiet warnings from anonymous sources. "You're poking at old ghosts," one email said. Another read, simply, "Some truths were buried for a reason." But they didn't stop. They couldn't. They understood now that it wasn't about proving a grand conspiracy. It was about revealing a neglected truth, that history had been distorted by fear, haste, and the need for a clean story. What they had uncovered didn't exonerate Oswald, but it demolished the comfort of certainty. Their exposé went live on a rainy Sunday morning. Within hours, it had gone viral, picked up by news outlets across the country. Readers were stunned, outraged, fascinated. Families of Kennedy aides and witnesses came forward with news stories. Archives were reopened. Congressional aides began murmuring about a new commission, not to find a smoking gun, but to untangle the web of secrets left behind. In the aftermath, Elaine stood outside the Kennedy gravesite in Arlington, watching the eternal flame flicker. Beside her, Theo held a single printed page, the last paragraph of their piece. The question isn't whether Oswald acted alone. The question is, why were so many people content to let us believe he did? The flame danced in the wind, and the truth, at last, began to burn through the myth. The ripple effects of Elaine and Theo's exposé were both immediate and far-reaching. News programs scrambled to line up guests who could comment on the revelations. Retired intelligence officers gave cryptic interviews, some defending the official record, others suggesting that the full truth was buried so deep, even they hadn't known it. In academic circles, the JFK assassination was suddenly no longer a dusty historical footnote, but a hotbed of renewed research. University symposiums were organized. Debates reopened. The phrase lone gunman theory was being spoken with increasing skepticism. And yet, Elaine felt no vindication. She stared at her inbox, now overflowing with messages from whistleblowers, conspiracy theorists, and descendants of those tangentially linked to Oswald, Ruby, or even Kennedy himself. A woman claiming to be the illegitimate child of a Cuban intelligence officer wrote, "My father said Oswald was just the trap. The real plan had two exits. He was never meant to walk away." It was impossible to tell fact from fiction now. They'd opened the floodgates. But Theo reminded her, that wasn't their job. Their job had been to pull the curtain back far enough to prove that the official version of history was incomplete, and in some cases, intentionally false. Still, there was one thread left dangling. A name that kept appearing in classified memos, scribbled notes, and redacted files: Artemis. Elaine first noticed it in a document summarizing intercepted communications between U.S. and Cuban operatives in late 1963. Artemis believes the operation is compromised, it read. No other context, no origin for the alias. Theo found it again in the CIA's 1964 internal assessment of the Mexico City station. Subject, redacted, referenced Artemis in coordination memo. Implied higher clearance. The word kept showing up, always in proximity to key anomalies. Oswald's movements, double agent reports, file discrepancies. It wasn't a code name for a person or even a location. It seemed to represent a project or perhaps an internal classification above top secret. Elaine submitted an expedited FOIA request for anything related to Project Artemis. Months passed. Finally, an envelope arrived at her apartment, hand-delivered with no return address. Inside was a single page, yellowed and creased. Project Artemis, November Contingency Protocol. In the event of operational failure or unintended visibility, assets must be neutralized. Public narrative must be controllable within 72 hours. Utilization of sacrificial intermediary is authorized. Target to be disavowed. Cleanup approved. It wasn't signed. No agency seal. Just a stamped date. November 18, 1963. Elaine stared at the document. Her hands trembled. For days before the assassination, the language was vague, couched in bureaucratic opacity, but unmistakably sinister. Sacrificial intermediary. Public narrative. Cleanup. She shared it with Theo immediately. He called her within minutes. Artemis wasn't about preventing the assassination, he said. It was a plan for after it happened. Elaine nodded silently, the weight of the realization crashing over her. They began tracing the document's potential origin. It bore markings consistent with CIA internal communications, but also elements that suggested Department of Defense involvement, possibly NSA. That meant the scope of the operation may have gone beyond Langley. Further digging led Theo to a defunct Navy intelligence program known as Shadow, which had operated under naval intelligence in tandem with the CIA from 1960 to 1964. The program's files had long been considered lost, accidentally destroyed in a warehouse fire, according to a 1982 review. But a digital backup, never cataloged, had survived in a university server archive tied to a research fellowship. Theo discovered a zip file labeled OS-63X. Inside were hundreds of pages of operational memos, flight manifests, agent evaluations, and one particularly disturbing summary. Subject Oswald was monitored during New Orleans and Mexico City phases. Behavioral instability remains concern, recommending transition to Phase 3. Artemis approval pending. Phase 3. The final act. Sacrifice. It was becoming clear that Oswald wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't a lone gunman. He was the fuse. The question then became, who lit it? Elaine and Theo began piecing together a chain of command, attempting to map which agencies, officials, or intermediaries might have greenlit Artemis. They encountered a dizzying mix of initials, code names, and long-dead bureaucrats. But certain figures kept surfacing, always near the edge of classified programs, always in advisory roles. One of them was General Marcus Harlan, a Pentagon liaison to the CIA and close friend of then Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Harlan had no formal role in the Warren Commission, yet memos placed him at closed-door strategy meetings days after the assassination. A memo from December 1963 stated, General H. believes narrative is holding. Public acceptance remains high. Artemis deemed successful. Elaine tracked down Harlan's daughter, now in her 60s, living in Virginia. She had long distanced herself from her father's legacy, but agreed to speak. My father was cold, she said. He used to say things like, sometimes the Republic needs silence more than truth. After the assassination, he changed. He stopped sleeping, kept a gun under his pillow. He'd say, the ghost never leaves. Elaine asked if he ever mentioned Oswald. Only once. He said, the boy thought he was important. He wasn't. He was a pawn on a broken board. When Elaine left the house, she sat in her car and cried. It wasn't grief, it was fury. Fury at the machinery that had chewed up a troubled man and spat out a legend. Fury at the lie that had been sold to a grieving nation. She and Theo finalized their second article, titled, Project Artemis, the Assassination Protocol the Government Denied. This time, the reaction was even more explosive. Congressional hearings were demanded. The intelligence committees scrambled to respond. Historians began rewriting textbook passages tentatively, and the American people, divided as ever, struggled with the implications. Some clung tighter to the lone gunman story, comforted by its simplicity. Others embraced the new evidence, their long-held suspicions now finally validated. Elaine received a call from a White House staffer. The president, newly elected and keen to restore trust in institutions, wanted to meet. In the Oval Office, The president thanked her. "You've reminded the country," he said, "that history belongs to the people, not the agencies, not the commissions, the people." Elaine responded calmly. "Then tell the agencies to stop rewriting it." He nodded solemnly. Outside, as she walked past the White House lawn, she saw tourists snapping photos, children laughing, school groups being led through the gates. Life had moved on, but underneath, the truth had left its mark, like a scar on the soul of the nation. And somewhere, in a locked drawer or forgotten vault, the rest of the story waited, watching, breathing, ready to be told. The backlash came swiftly. Within 48 hours of publishing Project Artemis, the assassination protocol the government denied, Elaine and Theo's phones were tapped. Their email accounts were frozen under the guise of routine security checks. A quiet but visible presence followed them. Gray sedans parked just far enough away, always occupied by men who didn't speak, didn't move much, but always watched. Elaine's apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, just moved. Drawers open, papers shuffled, notebooks oddly rearranged. A subtle message: "We can reach you. We see you." Still, they pressed forward. New information was pouring in. Witnesses emboldened by the sudden national reckoning, academics sharing their once-dismissed papers, even former agency operatives reaching out through encrypted channels. One such message came from an anonymous ex-CIA logistics officer known only as Redbird, who claimed to have facilitated Project Artemis's transport arrangements. His message read, "Phase 3 required contingency evac routes for all assets." Oswald was never scheduled for extraction. That wasn't a failure. That was the design. Elaine and Theo arranged a secure video call with Redbird. The man appeared only in silhouette, voice distorted, cautious. "You're asking the wrong question," he told them. "It's not just who wanted Kennedy dead. It's who needed the world to believe it was Oswald." He claimed that multiple government factions had become deeply disillusioned with Kennedy's policies by 1963, his refusal to invade Cuba again, his plans to withdraw from Vietnam, his attempts at détente with Khrushchev. But no single agency could act. Too dangerous, too visible, Redbird said. But a shared outcome? A convergence of motivations? That's Artemis. Elaine pressed him for names. Redbird laughed bitterly. Names change. Files burn. But the fingerprints stay. He offered to send one last document. A manifest list from November 1963, detailing a private military aircraft scheduled to depart from Dallas Love Field within 2 hours of the assassination. Its passenger list redacted, its purpose listed as Courier Evac, Artemis P. When the document arrived, it bore signatures of high-level clearance officers from multiple departments: CIA, NSA, DoD. Theo noted one signature that matched a long-retired intelligence figure now living in a remote part of Colorado. Against better judgment, they drove out to see him. He lived in a cabin, surrounded by woods, entirely off-grid. When they arrived, he was chopping wood, stooped, wiry, sunburned. Elaine introduced herself. He looked them both over, wiped sweat from his brow, and said, "Took you long enough." His name was Thomas Farnell. In 1963, he'd worked as a clearance officer within a special compartmentalized intelligence unit, reporting to the National Security Council. "You want to know what Artemis was?" he said. "It was insurance. For the country. For the system. We thought it was a kill switch to prevent civil unrest. Turns out it was the trigger." He didn't deny the assassination plan. He called it a confluence operation, a coordinated effort where each participant believed they were doing something slightly different, for reasons justified by national security. Oswald, he was the canvas. They painted him red, white, and crazy. Varnell showed them a weathered folder, one he claimed to have kept buried under his floorboards for 40 years. Inside were pages of handwritten logs, security directives, maps of Dealey Plaza marked with cryptic notations, and most importantly, a photograph. It was grainy, but unmistakable. Oswald, in Mexico City, standing beside two men previously unidentified in official records. One bore a resemblance to Howard Hunt, a CIA operative later implicated in Watergate. The other man resembled David Morales, known within intelligence circles as the Wolf, a shadowy figure rumored to have worked on multiple black ops from Cuba to Laos. Elaine and Theo took photos of everything. "Why show us this now?" Theo asked. "Because I'm dying," Varnell said. And because the lie has lasted too long, they left the cabin with enough material for another article, one that would name names, connect operations, and show how the machinery of silence had operated for over 60 years. But that night, Varnell's cabin burned to the ground. The authorities called it an accident. Faulty wiring. Elaine didn't believe it for a second. The final article, titled "Burn the Myth, Names Behind the Smoke," was their most direct piece yet. It outlined the existence of Artemis as a psychological containment protocol designed not only to manage public perception, but to streamline control of the official narrative post-crisis. The involvement of multiple intelligence sectors, each given plausible deniability by compartmentalizing their roles. The military approved tactical readiness scenarios. The CIA prepared asset neutralization and narrative reinforcement. The FBI monitored domestic targets, Oswald among them. The coordinated discrediting of witnesses, including early testimonies pointing to shooters on the grassy knoll, suspicious movement within the Texas School Book Depository, and conflicting medical reports from Parkland Hospital. The psychological profiling of Oswald, who had long shown signs of mental instability and could be easily manipulated. Evidence showed that handlers fed him conflicting missions, leading him to believe he was both informer and revolutionary. The attempted destruction of Artemis-related records, including the fire that supposedly consumed Navy files in 1970, and later efforts to suppress or mislabel Project Artemis under different code names, Operation Duskfall, Protocol Aurora. The article concluded with this line: "The truth was never buried, it was scattered. Now, the fragments form a shape we can no longer ignore." This time, the reaction wasn't viral hysteria. It was a reckoning. A special congressional hearing was launched. Former agents came forward, sometimes under oath, sometimes anonymously. The intelligence community went into quiet panic mode. Some retired operatives vanished. Others confessed, but only in vague terms. The word Artemis became as infamous as MKUltra, COINTELPRO, or Iran-Contra. Elaine sat alone on her apartment balcony as the sun set, scrolling through messages, some grateful, others threatening. Theo called. His voice was tired but calm. "We did what we came to do," he said. "I don't know if it's enough," Elaine replied. "Maybe it's not about enough," he said. "Maybe it's just about not lying anymore." A week later, she received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single cassette tape, labeled Oswald, Final Interrogation, November 24th, 1963, unreleased. She found a cassette player at a vintage shop and pressed play. Oswald's voice crackled through the speakers, defiant, confused, exhausted. "I don't know what I'm being charged with. I want legal counsel. I was in the building, yes, but I didn't shoot anybody. They told me I was part of something bigger. I didn't know. I didn't know I'd be the one." There was a pause. "You're not listening. I'm not who you think I am." The tape ended. She sat in silence for a long time. Then, quietly, she whispered, "So who were you?" The last piece of the puzzle arrived in the form of a phone call from an unexpected source. The voice on the other end was familiar. Theo, though the tone was more urgent than usual. "Elaine, you won't believe this, but I found something," he said, his words quick and sharp. "It's not just a fragment. It's the core." Elaine's pulse quickened. She had thought they had uncovered all there was to uncover. But the gravity in Theo's voice suggested otherwise. "What did you find?" she asked, trying to steady herself. "The CIA, right under our noses. You know the memos we've been looking through? There's one final document we haven't touched. It's buried in plain sight, labeled as Operational Appendix, Final Review. It's a summary from a meeting, dated November 25th, 1963, the day after Oswald was killed. It's a draft of an official statement, and it implicates higher-ups, far higher than we thought. It's a blueprint for the cover-up." Elaine stood, her mind racing. "Are you saying it's an official plan?" "Exactly. It's not just a manipulation of facts. It's a preemptive strike to control the narrative before the public could even start to ask questions." Theo's revelation didn't just rattle her. It shattered her belief in the simple explanations they'd clung to. They had always suspected that the truth was far more convoluted. But this was something else entirely. She immediately began making arrangements to meet him. It was late when they finally reconvened in a secure location. a backroom of a quiet bar in a forgotten neighborhood. Theo slid the document across the table. It was typed in precise font, with careful notes about narrative direction and media compliance. The document, marked confidential, do not distribute, was written in the terse, bureaucratic language that Elaine had come to expect from high-level intelligence reports. But it was what it said that left her breathless. Operational Appendix, Final Review. Date, November 25, 1963. Subject, Public Narrative Oversight, JFK Assassination. The agency's position remains firm. Lee Harvey Oswald is the lone assassin. All secondary theories must be rejected as a matter of national security. In light of recent developments, a coordinated media strategy will be launched to bolster this claim. Immediately upon Oswald's death, a staged series of events must occur. Oswald's prior history of lone wolf behavior must be amplified across all channels. The narrative surrounding possible conspiratorial theories must be immediately associated with extremist groups. All first-hand accounts of potential multiple shooters must be cast as unreliable or politically motivated. Any photographic or audio evidence of additional parties will be dismissed as unsubstantiated, requiring immediate disavowal from expert sources. There it was in black and white, an acknowledgement that the narrative had been crafted long before the assassination took place. There had been a plan to control the story, to suppress any alternative explanation, to suppress the truth. "What is this?" Elaine whispered, her voice trembling. "This is a confession, Theo." "It's not a confession," he replied darkly. "It's a strategy guide." The document detailed the tactics that would soon unfold in the weeks and months after the assassination. Shifting blame, destroying evidence, managing public perception through controlled leaks, planting disinformation, and above all, establishing Oswald as the sole actor in the tragedy. The plan was simple: contain, suppress, and isolate the truth, and keep it under wraps for as long as possible. But even more chilling than the tactics described in the document was the final note, a reference to a secondary plan titled Project Eclipse. In the event that the public refuses to accept the official narrative, a secondary line of action will be activated. This may include, but is not limited to, increased surveillance of activist groups, misinformation campaigns, strategic assassination attempts, and psychological operations to redirect focus away from the core issue. Elaine's stomach churned. Psychological operations. It was a term she had seen used before, but never with such cold finality. This was not just about silencing one man or controlling a story. It was about dominating an entire narrative, a process of shaping reality itself. Theo continued, "You see it now, don't you? Oswald wasn't just set up to take the fall. The entire country was set up to take a fall, and they've been controlling the fall ever since." Elaine didn't respond immediately. The implications were too vast, too overwhelming. They had suspected something large, something sinister, but they had never imagined the sheer scale of the operation. The long-term manipulation of not just the assassination's aftermath, but of an entire generation's understanding of truth and history. "We need to take this public," Elaine said, her voice hardening. "The people have a right to know. We can't let them sweep it all under the rug again." Theo nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. "We've already pushed them far. I don't know if they'll let us do this again." Elaine met his gaze. "They've been lying for 60 years. We can't stop now. We've already lit the spark." It was a risk, but it was one they had to take. The next day, they published their final piece, titled Project Eclipse, the hidden blueprint behind the JFK cover-up. The article was explosive, more so than any of their previous work. It contained full transcriptions of the operational appendix document, an analysis of its impact, and a call for immediate declassification of all related files. It painted a damning picture of not just the government's failure to be transparent, but its deliberate, calculated efforts to rewrite the assassination's history and control the public's perception. Almost instantly, there was an uproar. This time, the response wasn't just from conspiracy theorists or historians. The mainstream media was forced to confront the new revelations. A special congressional inquiry was swiftly announced. Experts were interviewed on live television. Former CIA operatives and political figures who had remained silent for decades were now talking, some apologizing, others deflecting blame. And then came the most remarkable shift. The president, who had previously stayed silent on the matter, called a national address. With somber words, he acknowledged the need for a full, transparent review of historical events. He promised that no stone would go unturned. The truth, he said, was something the American people deserved to know. It wasn't a victory, not entirely, but it was the beginning of a long-awaited reckoning. As Elaine and Theo watched the waves of media attention, they sat in the same quiet room where it had all begun, the weight of their work sinking in. "It's over," Theo said quietly. "No," Elaine replied, shaking her head. "It's just starting." She stood and walked to the window, staring out over the city. The world had changed, perhaps irrevocably, but the truth, she knew, had a way of forcing itself to the surface, even if it had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the light. Behind her, Theo stood in silence, watching the same view. But he understood now. The truth was never really hidden. It was just waiting for someone to find it. And they had found it. The story of the Kennedy assassination would never be the same. And in the years that followed, historians would rewrite the past, pointing to the declassified documents, the whistleblowers, and the articles that had started it all. But one thing remained certain. The quest for truth had become more than just a pursuit. It had become an irreversible force. And no one would be able to bury it again.